course, darling, come here. Of course, darling, I'm gonna give you some kisses. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. That you're gonna be fine. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That we have some red honey here. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That we have some red honey. Of course, darling, everything is gonna be fine. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. To take on with me, which take on with me things. Of course, darling, that is what you can say. That no one can against me. That I'm fine. That I love you so much. Of course, darling, I just wanna give you a kiss right a little bit. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna jump. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That I have everything I want. Of course, darling, I'm always the bad guy, but I don't wanna. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I don't wanna be the bad guy, but I'm always the bad guy. What can you do against that? If I have to be the villain, I'm gonna be a good villain. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna be fine. That I'm gonna be a good villain. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I have everything I need. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I have a bike. Of course, darling, I have a pool. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. And I wanna be there and I wanna be fine. Of course, darling, I love you so much.
Eureka Beats.
Of course, darling, I wanna be in the pool and I wanna be fine. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I wanna live, that I wanna survive. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That I have here. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I play like that. That I'm a little bit kind of a villain. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. But I have the 100 platinum bill, of course, darling, that is what you can have. And I have to be a little bit of devil, of course, but okay, that is what you can have. That I play like a zombie, of course, darling, that is what you can have. And that I go to America and I survive like I can. To South America and I survive like I can. Of course, I come with my rich bitch and of course I have money. That is what you can have. That they always more, but I never give them more. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I wanna survive. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm kind of the devil with my rich bitch and of course, darling, that is what you can have. But okay, what can you do against that? Just nothing. Of course, darling, that is what you can say. That I don't wanna kill no one. Of course, darling, that I'm gonna be like a zombie and I'm gonna share a shot. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna share a shot and I'm gonna shoot myself. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. That I have my truths here. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I come with my truth and everything is fine. Of course, darling, I'm gonna shake a little bit. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, I just remember that little bit and everyone is with the counts. Of course, the bitches are counting my money and everyone knows they have the platinum bill. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. And I just wanna cash it. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me and I have to be a little bit the devil. I'm gonna be like a zombie. Of course, darling, and
Eureka Beats.
Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That if I have to be the devil, I'm gonna be like a zombie, and I'm gonna shout, and I'm gonna shoot myself, and I'm gonna have my truth, and I'm gonna have my little tiger with the truth, and I'm gonna shake a little bit. Of course, darling, that is what she can have, and so I'm gonna survive. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna share a shot, and I'm gonna have my tools. I'm gonna shoot myself. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. That I'm gonna be fine. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That I'm gonna jump into the pool. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. And if they wanna make me pull in white, okay, darling, what can I do against that? Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I don't hate anyone. That is what you can have. Of course, darling, I'm not a hater. Of course, darling, I don't hate people. That is what you can have. That I don't wanna hate no one. That I blow myself and give a kiss. Of course, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling.
Eureka Beats.
Of course, darling, I'm gonna be like a zombie, and I'm gonna share a shot. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna have my truth. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I have to say those I'm taking from my money. Of course, darling, I hope they don't decline my pool. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That's a little trap. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That's a little trap. Of course, if I have to be the villain, then give them what they want. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they hate people. Of course, darling, I don't hate no one. Of course, darling, I don't wanna hate no one. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I love myself and give a kiss. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, that if they wanna make my pool in wine, I'm gonna survive. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna swim. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can say. That if they wanna villain, I'm gonna give them a good villain. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can say. That no one can against me. That I will survive. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm here. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I stay $100 bill in the pool from the beach, from the cold. Of course, they put me in Spain. Of course, and give them a 30 cars in the court. But okay, what can you do against that? Just nothing. Of course, darling, and I have a theater in the court, and my wife, my ex-wife, is the mother from the theater, from the court, and they are the whole time with that, like she was the bitch from the king. Of course, darling, they are more interested in having. They're more interested in my ex-wife than in the throne. Of course, darling, they have a theater in the court. Of course, and they are the whole time with my ex-wife like model. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm in the real world, in the tower 32. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. And she was the bitch from the theater, from the court. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. What can you do against it? Just nothing, darling, just survive. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. But okay, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, that I'm gonna jump in Diana's pool that you can relent. Of course, darling, I'm gonna try to survive. And that they don't make me water and wine. Of course, darling, if you wanna villain, they're gonna have a good villain. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I don't hit no one. Of course, darling, that I blow myself and give a kiss. Of course, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. Of course, darling, that I don't hit no one. Of course, darling, that you're like high science, so don't neglect. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That you're wow. Of course, darling, you're next. I love you so much. Of course, darling, I have the papers and I'm gonna do money. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against me. That I'm arriving. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I love you so much. Of course, darling, I'm gonna blow myself and give a kiss and forget about everyone. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna blow myself and give a kiss and I love you so much. Of course, darling, kisses and bye. I love you.